I would like you to please open your Bibles in the book of Mark and go to chapter 3. And the narration began there by saying, "And he entered again into the synagogue, and there was a man there which had a withered hand." What day was it? What was Jesus doing there? A Sabbath, and he went to the synagogue. And they watched him whether he would heal him on the Sabbath day, that they might accuse him. So what was happening as Jesus was there in the synagogue? They knew that there was a man with a problem, right? And they were watching him. And he saith unto the man which had the withered hand, "Stand forth." And he saith unto them, Is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath days, or to do evil, to save life, or to kill? But they held their peace. And when he had looked around about on them with anger, being grieved for the hardness of their hearts, he saith unto the man, "Stretch forth thy hand." And he stretched it out, and his hand was restored whole as the other. And the Pharisees went forth, and straightway took counsel with the Herodians against him, how they might destroy him. So there were two groups of people, I'm sure that there were more, watching on Christ as he came into the synagogue on the Sabbath day. They knew that there was this man who had a problem with his hand. And they were watching and seeing if he will heal him on the Sabbath day. Jesus, knowing what was going on in their hearts, it says here in verse 5, he looked around about to see what they were going to say. He knew what they had in their hearts. And being grieved for the hardness of their heart. You know, our Lord Jesus Christ suffered a lot of criticism. There were many people spying on him. Everywhere he went, there were people looking and seeing what he was going to do in different instances. We have one instance in Mark chapter 2, verse 6 and 7. Notice there. Mark 2, verse 6 and 7. "Why doth this man thus speak blasphemies? Who can forgive sins but God only?" The scribes were there. They were reasoning where? In their hearts. How can this man forgive sins? They were continually being over him. Mark chapter 2, verse 6 through 7. And in another occasion, in the same book of Mark, in the same chapter, but go down to verse 16. "And when the scribes and Pharisees saw him eat with publicans and sinners, they said unto his disciples, How is it that he eateth and drinketh with publicans and sinners?" In the same chapter, go down to verse 23 and 24. "And it came to pass that he went through the cornfield on the Sabbath day, and his disciples began as they went to pluck the ears of corn. And the Pharisees said unto him, Behold, why do they on the Sabbath day that which is not lawful?" So, continually, not only Christ but his disciples, they always have something to say, always something to criticize him about. We can see how the conflict between the religious leaders of that day and our Lord Jesus Christ was escalating. Just on the same chapter, you see it 3 times. Not only was escalating, but they were criticizing and they were plotting against him. We just read it in Mark chapter 3, verse 1 and 2, how they wanted to see what he was going to do with this man. And especially because, at this time and this occasion of Mark chapter 3, he cured the men on the Sabbath day. And they were ready. And now there is two different groups here, the Pharisees and the Herodians. Very interesting that these two, they did not like each other. You know? But in this occasion, what happened? They came together for a common goal. What was that goal? To see how they could destroy him. It's very interesting. But I would like to look at one issue here. In chapter 3, verse 5, it mentions there that Jesus was grieved for the hardness of their heart. What was going on? Notice in the question on verse 4, it says, is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath day or to do evil? To save life or to kill? They couldn't answer. What was the lawful thing to do? It was to save life, not to let it be, not to let it continue in that situation. But because Christ went ahead and performed a miracle, they went out. They sought counsel that they could destroy him. Why was it that they did not appreciate what Jesus did for the men? We can see that they regarded the Sabbath as a very strict day, right? And to do anything that would deviate from what they thought it was correct, they were condemning Jesus. They hardened their hearts, but also they were hardening their thoughts, because they went out to do what? To counsel among themselves how they could destroy him, how they could get him and be able to put Jesus aside. It's very interesting. The Bible in Proverbs chapter 23, verse 7, it says, for as he thinketh in his heart, so is he. What kind of a thoughts were the Pharisees and the Herodians cherishing? They were plotting to kill someone. And as you saw in the examples that were given before in Mark chapter 2, they were constantly upon him, looking and see how they could criticize him. If we consider the problem a little further, in Matthew chapter 15, Matthew 15, verses 18 through 19, notice what Jesus said. But those things which proceed out of the mouth come forth from the heart, and they defile the men. For out of the heart proceedeth evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, fornication, thefts, false witness, and blasphemies. Verse 20, these are the things which defile a man, but to eat with unwashed hands defile not a man. So when they were thinking, plotting to destroy him, to kill him, to get rid of him, what was happening in their hearts? They were defiling themselves. If we consider this problem of hardening of hearts, who comes to your mind when you think about somebody hardening their hearts? Pharaoh is one that comes to mind, right? Who else comes to mind? The what? Judas, okay. Who else? Saul, yes. What about Cain? What about the children of Israel as a whole, as a nation? But what makes a person to harden their heart? If you notice in the verses that we have been reading, there is something very consistent in chapter 2 and chapter 3. And the consistency was that there was Jesus and his disciples, they were doing something good. Evidences were there that they could not refute. Did Pharaoh had evidences that God was the God of heaven? Yes, he did, right? He sent Moses, and he saw the miracle that happened. But he began hardening his heart when he realized that God was asking for something. In the book Conflict and Courage, page 88 says, every rejection of light hardens the heart and darkens the understanding. And thus men find it more and more difficult to distinguish between right and wrong. And they become bolder in resisting the will of God. What happened to Cain? God told him, he was upset with his brother. And God came and said, why is your countenance like this? He said, no problem. But did he have a problem? Yes. What was he thinking? God said to him, if you do not change, sin lieth at the door. He was thinking about taking the life of his brother. And he eventually carried it out. But the thoughts began to be hardened in his heart too. It's very interesting, brethren, that when a person begins hardening their heart, it leads to a spiritual dullness and inability to see truth. That happened to Cain. It happened to Pharaoh. It happened to the children of Israel. And the Pharisees and the Herodians were not the exception in this case. They were preparing their mind, their heart, and the inability to see the truth. They have not only seen with their own eyes the miracle or the miracles that Jesus had done, but they also have heard all the miracles that he had done. The evidences were there. But they began closing their eyes to the truth. And it's very interesting that this was the issue why Jesus began speaking in parables. Matthew 13, verse 13 through 15. Matthew 13, 13 through 15 says, therefore speak I to them in parable, because they see not, and hearing they hear not, neither do they understand. And in them is fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah, which saith, by hearing ye shall hear, and shall not understand, and seeing ye shall see, and shall not perceive. For this people's heart is wax gross, and their ears are dull of hearing, and their eyes they have closed, lest at any time they should see with their eyes, and hear with their ears, and should understand with their heart, and should be converted, and I should heal them. So this is what it was happening. Because of their spiritual senses were becoming clouded, Jesus began talking in parables and they could not understand. Even sometimes the disciples themselves didn't understand the parables, so they have to call him aside and say, Master, what do you mean by this? Mark chapter 8, verse 13 through 21. Notice, Mark 8, 13 through 21. And he left them, and entering into the ship again, departed to the other side. Now the disciples had forgotten to take bread, neither had they in the ship with them more than one loaf. And he charged them, saying, Take heed, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and of the leaven of Herod. And they reasoned among themselves, saying, It is because we have no bread. And when Jesus knew it, he said unto them, Why reason ye because ye have no bread? Perceive ye not yet? Neither understand? Have ye your heart yet hardened? Having eyes, see ye not? And having ears, hear ye not? And do ye not remember? When I brake the 5 loaves among the 5,000, how many baskets full of fragments took ye up? They say unto him, 12. And when the 7 among 4,000, how many baskets full of fragments took ye up? And they 7. And he said unto them, How is it that ye do not understand? And he cometh to Bethsaida, and they bring a blind man unto him, and besought him to touch him. And he took the blind man by the hand, and led him out of the town. And when he had spit on his eyes, and put his hands upon him, he asked him if he saw aught. And so, brethren, here we see what was happening. Jesus was talking to them, and in some case they couldn't understand themselves, the parables and the things. It also, when somebody hardens their heart, that leads to mental resistance, a refusal to consider what might be true. Pharaoh was the case. The Pharisees, as we have been reading, they got so blind that they disregard the good that Jesus was doing, and they closed their minds, their hearts, their eyes, the spiritual eyesight. But this was nothing new. They were following the exact same pattern that their forefathers had followed. In Hebrews chapter 3, verses 12 and 16, Hebrews 3, 12 and 16. It says, Take heed, brethren, lest there be in any of you an evil heart of unbelief in departing from the living God. But exhort one another daily, while it is called today, lest any of you be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin. For we are made partakers of Christ, if we hold the beginning of our confidence steadfast unto the end. What is said, Today, if you hear his voice, harden not your hearts, as in the provocation. For some, when they have heard, they provoke. Howbeit, not all that came out of Egypt by Moses. But with whom was he grieved 40 years? Was it not with them that had sinned, whose carcasses fell in the wilderness? So, the same pattern. They were hardening their hearts as in the past, following the steps of their forefathers. And what is the end result, brethren, of allowing our hearts to be hardened? Proverbs 28:14. Proverbs 28:14 says, Happy is the man that feareth always, but he that hardeneth his heart shall fall into mischief. The end result, brethren, is calamity. What happened to the church in the wilderness when they provoked God and they hardened their heart with unbelief? At the end, they died in the wilderness. The whole time. Hardness of heart is a very serious problem. Very, very serious problem, brethren. And we will touch later on what can we do? So for us not to have it, and for us not to make others to have it. Now, what about hardening our thoughts? How does God consider our thoughts? Proverbs 15:26. Proverbs 15:26. The thoughts of the wicked are an abomination unto the Lord, but the words of the pure are pleasant words. So the Lord considered that wicked thoughts. How? An abomination. What is an abomination? It's something that God despises. So, when we allow our heart, our thoughts to become hard, can God work with us? No, He cannot. What kind of thoughts were the Pharisees and the Herodians having? To plot Christ, right? That much hard were their thoughts. It was continually always thinking there was always somebody behind Christ. They became even aggressive. And this is the interesting thing. They were opposed to one another in many aspects of life, doctrines and everything. But in this case, they unite. And they became aggressive to Christ. And the same occurs today in many instances, especially in the political environment. When a common ground, even though they may disagree, but if a common ground, no problem. It got to be so bad that you remember when Pilate brought Christ and Barabbas. The question was, choose or Jesus or Barabbas. And what did they say? Give us Barabbas. And notice the Pharisees and the elders said, it is better for one man to die than the whole nation to perish. This is the union that can be when something is done that is good. Others always try to destroy it. Now, what about us as a church? I think it was mentioned, I heard something this morning. What happens sometimes when in the religious activities that we have, we differ in the way maybe sometimes how we do things? Put aside doctrine. No, just thoughts. Somebody wants to do it this way, somebody wants to do it the other way. And what is easy to do? Is it easier to say, yeah, sure, let's try the way you want to do it? What is easier? The easiest thing to do is for us to criticize. That's the easiest thing to do. And it becomes evident when we treat others, when we ignore them, when we abuse them. And in some cases, hard thoughts leads to verbal abuse. And in some cases, even violence. The interesting thing about hard thoughts is that they do not remain only a thought. In many cases, they transform into deeds. We can see it in the case of Cain. It did transform into taking the life of his brother. In the case of Christ, the thought was there, let us get together, let us plot to remove him completely out of the picture. And they were seeking to destroy him. It's very sad. But now how can we avoid these hard thoughts? What are some of the alternatives that we can have to this problem? Let me give you an example before I continue. There is one thing that I don't like, and I dislike it very much. When someone raises his voice to talk to me, I don't like it. and I will not respond. Since I was little, I am like that. I just don't like it. What is the reaction when somebody speaks loud to anyone? I mean, that's my response. I don't like to, I'm not a confronting person. But what happens when a person speaks loud to somebody else, especially when there is an issue, when there is a problem? What is the reaction, the normal reaction? Sure, they began talking loud, and the louder it gets, the better, right? No, it shouldn't be that way. What should we do when someone is having difficulties and comes up with hard words, even hard actions? What should we do? Should we respond the same way? What should we do, brethren? Can we soften that person? Yes. If we speak soft, what will happen? It will turn away, right? Ephesians chapter 4, verse 32. And be ye kind one to another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, even as God for Christ's sake has forgiven you. What is the counsel that the apostle gives? He said, be kind one to another, tender-hearted. Who had that experience? Who comes to your mind having an experience like that? After the people were trying him, one after one case and another case. Who comes to your mind? Moses. Yes, Moses. Moses comes to mind. He was very tender-hearted. He even prayed to God that if you are going to do this to this nation, blot me out of it too. Yes, the meekest man on this earth. Colossians chapter 3, verse 12. And 13. Put on therefore as the elect of God, holy and beloved, bowels of mercy, kindness, humbleness of mind, meekness, long-suffering, forbearing one another, and forgiving one another. If any man have a quarrel against any, even as Christ forgave you, so also do ye. What is the counsel given here? Even what it says? Somebody has a quarrel against any. That's a very strong word. But how can we accomplish this? If our nature is, the tendency is to react towards the wrong. It is only, as we says here, put on therefore as the elect of God, holy and beloved. What do we need to put on? Christ, right? When we see Jesus in his life, what do we realize that he did? Did he get angry? How do we understand then what we read in Mark chapter 3, verse 5? He said that he looked and he was angry. What happened to Christ? He never reacted. We may not like things that others may say to us or about us, but what can you do? Really, what can you do? Almost nothing. Unless the person comes and talks to you, that's a different story. But if you hear things, just, don't worry about it. There is a God in heaven that sees and hears things. So as we practice these principles here, let us read Colossians chapter 3, verse 16. Notice what it says here. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly in all wisdom, teaching and admonishing one another. Where the wisdom comes from? It comes from God. Then when we have the wisdom, it say teach and admonish one another. Admonishing one another is not something easy to do. Why? Because we don't like to counsel. And that is contrary to the Bible. The Bible says that we should counsel one another. In Luke chapter 8, in verse 15, it gives us an idea what we need to do. Luke 8, verse 15. But that on the good ground are they which an honest and good heart, having heard the word, keep it, and bring forth fruit with patience. What do you do in order to have a good ground to be able to plant something? How is the ground before? Oh, it's very hard, right? And especially here in Virginia, has a lot of clay. You have to really work on that ground. So if somebody has a very hard heart, what do you need to do? You need to keep working on that person, removing that soil. Because what you want to do is to plant a good seed, right? But how many people likes really to keep removing and removing and removing things, especially as you plow? I had an experience one time. I decided, I'm going to do this and have a garden and do this. I read a little bit here and there, but I didn't go as deep as I should have. And what happened? Even though I planted good seeds, guess what happened to those seeds? Some grew, some didn't, and the ones that grew eventually died. Why? Because the soil was not prepared good enough. So persevering in helping somebody that has a hard heart is a key. Going over and over, trying to win them to Christ is not an easy task, but we can do it. How is it possible that people that had been even criminals have become Christians? It's because somebody decided to work with them over and over, going through this, until they open their heart. What about those that have hard thoughts? What can we do? How can we help somebody that have this mindset? I was asked to participate and to be able to help people with depression, and we had to see some videos. And there is one key element on helping somebody to come out of depression is that they have to there is a period of 14 days. That person cannot and should not, under any circumstance, allow the mind to have bad thoughts. And I thought that was very challenging, because don't we have bad thoughts? And they don't have to be bad to like trying to hurt somebody, but just to say something negative, okay? For 14 days. Now, the idea is that the person should be able to train the mind in such a way that that negative thought is expressed in a different way, but not negative. Because the negative thought has an influence on the person that receives it and in the person that has the thought. And it was interesting because it's very challenging. The whole course is very, very challenging, not only for the one that is trying to learn how to deal with these situations, but also for the person that is actually having the problem. Why? Because one of the characteristics of a person that is depressed is he blames him or herself for everything. Why this happens to me? Why is only me? And the thing goes on. But can we, as Christians, stop having negative thoughts, even about somebody? In Counsels on Health, page 297 says, "It is a great evil, and one which exists among our people to a great extent, to give loose rein to the thoughts, to question and criticize everything another does, making mountains out of molehills, and thinking their own ways are right. Whereas, if they were in the same place as their brother, they might not do half as well as he does. It is just as natural for someone to find fault with one another, and that as it is for them to breathe. They have formed the habit of criticizing others, when they themselves are the ones who should be brought severely to task, and their wicked speeches and hard feelings be burned out of their souls by the purifying fire of God's love." It is so hard, but it can be done. It says here that those feelings should be burned out of the soul by the purifying fire of God's love. So when someone comes to us with hard feelings or hard words, hard thoughts, whatever it may be, how do we need to react? Kind, with love. That love will quench that, will stop that. You know, I read a story. There was a father. Every time he came home, he would find things out of place in his house. And he would get very upset, very upset. And so he decided, well, I'm a Christian, my family is Christian, we need to do something to fix this. So he began praying every day. "Father, which art in heaven, I ask you to please change my wife. Father, which art in heaven, I ask you to change my children." And he went name by name, change him, help him to put up his clothes, help him to put up his shoes, help him to do this, help my wife not to have the house this way, and so on. He prayed for months. He prayed for years. What happened? Nothing happened. Actually, no, something happened. It got worse. Until finally one day, he decided, one thing. Guess what he decided to do? He decided to begin praying so God will change him. The principle works both ways, you know. Yes, you know, we may be praying for somebody else to change. Oh, this person have this problem in his character, or I don't like the way this and that and here and there and everything. But what can be the problem? And the greatest problem is ourselves. I read another story. There was an accident, and they rushed the young man to the hospital. The surgeon wasn't there, but he was called. There was an accident, and they needed him to arrive immediately at the hospital. 5 minutes went by, 10 minutes went by. Finally, the doctor arrived. At this point, it was a very critical situation. At this point, the father of the young man was very irritated. He saw the doctor. The doctor came in and said, "Hello, how are you?" He said, "How can you speak to me like that? My son is dying, and they need you there. Just relax. We will take care. We will do the best we can." He said, "Come on, go in and take care of my son." And the doctor said, "Sir, you need to pray. You need to pray that God will be merciful to your son. Please, go." So, you know, the doctor went and got ready. And after an hour, hour and a half, you know, he came out. He said, "Your son is okay. He will be fine. And just wait here for him. And if you have any questions, you can talk to the nurse." And the father just looked at the doctor, and the doctor turned around and left. Then the nurse came out, and he started, "Why was he like that? He needed to answer my question." And the nurse looked at him, and she began crying. He said, "His son had an accident yesterday, and that son died. He was at the funeral home when we called him to come to operate your son. He left the funeral home and came here and operated your son. And he just went back to the funeral home to finish what he was doing." The man didn't say anymore. You know, we need to learn that our words have an impact on others. We can harden somebody's heart, their thoughts, by the way we speak, by the way we act. Let us pray, brethren, that God will give us the spirit of Moses, that we can have that experience, that we can have the character of Christ. You know, yes, sometimes, you know, things may appear one way for us, but we don't know what's going on with the other person. We need to be very careful. We don't want to be a stumbling block. But we need to pray that the Spirit of Christ may dwell in our hearts, so our actions, our words, and everything we do be pleasing to God and be a touching point for somebody else to change. This is why, brethren, I believe as we sing this song, 483, we need to meditate. Actually, this should be our prayer, 483, that our words become so precious that we can touch somebody's heart. Not because of us, but because of the God we love. "If any little word of mine make a dark life brighter, if any little son of mine make a sad heart lighter, God help me speak the helping word, and sweeten it with singing, and drop it in some lonely vale to set the echoes ringing."